So, Dave, one of the first things that you and I ever did together as a project was record some videos about preaching and getting ready for Easter. Do you remember that?
I do remember that.
That was one of my first times really doing extended teaching just to a camera. And you told me something that helped me so much. Do you remember what you told me?
I do. Yeah, it was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed that project, but I knew that you were newer to the concept of talking to a camera, and I had spent years doing live stream. If you think of it as just talking to a camera, it can be cold. It can feel really arrogant a little bit, like all of these people will watch. But what I learned through live stream was that there are real people on the other side of that camera with real stories, and they're going to take something that you say. You don't know what it's going to be, but they're going to take something that you say. They'll have some sort of an aha moment at some point in time, and they'll point back and they'll say, it was when you said. And I know that's true because as some of these relationships that I formed through live streaming, just holding my phone up on Periscope and Meerkat and even Facebook Live when it was brand new.
Yeah, you're an OG, man.
I am an OG. They would reach out to me and they say, when you said this.
Yeah.
And in a very similar manner, I'm like, I don't think I ever said that, but great. So
yeah, well, that helped me so much. There are other people on the other side of this, and they really are listening to what you have to say. Talk to them. And that was really great. So hopefully we can get some more of your great wisdom.
We'll see. Hey, welcome back to the Preaching Through podcast. This is the conversation that takes place when pastors come together to talk about what it is to preach Jesus in the 21st century. You're not meant to do ministry alone. You're not meant to do life alone. And if we can be just one voice of encouragement, one voice challenging you to really elevate your game in areas that are key to what God has called you to do vocationally or bivocationally, we would really be thrilled to have that opportunity. And so what we do every single episode, talk about the different nuances that we find ourselves in when it comes to the preaching moment. And so that can be preaching through Christmas and Easter. That can be preaching through a nonfiction book. That could be preaching through books of the Bible. And today we are talking about what it is to preach through a camera.
Yeah, it's this is an episode I would have, when I started ministry, never thought would ever be a thing.
Yeah.
Right? Like who to preach through a camera? What do you mean? And yet here we are where, it used to be that the folks that maybe would preach to a camera might be the really big church pastors who, somehow broadcasted on Christian TV, or perhaps folks who would make some sort of video teaching series. And now it's like everybody preaches through camera in one way, shape, or form. And a lot of us are doing it even more intentionally. And so, we thought, man, this is something that is a common enough experience now for those of us who are communicating the gospel. Let's talk about how to do it well.
It's evolved over time. I remember when I've got the Indescribable DVD by Louis Giglio.
Okay.
And it was just him on stage preaching.
Yep.
And so it wasn't a, to the camera, but there was very much cameras involved. It was a produced, event.
That one feels a bit like a TED Talk, right?
Where it feels a lot like a TED Talk.
He's really using the visuals, and he's talking about space and the universe and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah. And then the next one, which I loved the Indescribable so much. The next one, I think it's How Great Is Our God or something like that. And it is really getting down into the body. And it is the laminin, which is formed in the shape of a cross, holding everything together. Like when you break it all the way down, just before an atomic level, it is laminin. And I was like, I got to get more DVDs.
Now, hold
like
on,
this.
though, Dave. But you weren't in the room?
I was not in the room, but I felt like
Well,
it.
how could you have been impacted by something that you weren't in the room for?
Oh, okay. I see what you're saying here.
So you were on the other side of that camera.
I was on the other
and
side.
it changed your life, and it made a
changed my
difference.
life.
And now we get to be maybe none of us will ever quite be Louis Giglio, but we get to have the same kind of impact with people who are watching us, whether they're in the room or not.
We do. So I thought a great way to start the conversation before we really dive in is to just maybe identify some of the differences between preaching through a camera and then preaching on the platform or from the pulpit. And I think it's important for us to note that even as we were planning this episode, you and I were on different wavelengths. I was thinking, yeah, it's very much the preaching moment on Sunday and it's the live stream. And you were very much thinking it's more supplemental things that you would do throughout the week. And I was like, well, let's talk about both.
Yeah.
So there are differences, not just in the way you can use the recorded material, but even how you appear on the recorded material. And so, what are some of the similarities that you see when it comes to specifically, we'll not talk about just broadcasting a live stream, though we will get into that, but specifically preaching and focusing your attention on a camera versus the pulpit?
Yeah. So I'm doing much more of that kind of teaching than I ever imagined, where it really is in more of a studio type environment or more of a set shot environment where the folks are helping think through the angle of the camera and the lighting and different stuff like that. And of course, one of the cool things today is how, because so many people are just recording on their phones and TikTok and Instagram reels and everything, like video production quality has
Yeah.
gone way down, which is actually kind of nice.
Right.
But what I'm talking about when I think about preaching to a camera, like you said, we'll talk about what it is when really you're preaching to the room, but the camera's on. That's a different thing than actually preaching to the camera. So I will maybe once or twice a year create a special message that is only delivered online. We'll do this like we did this last year on Christmas Day. We didn't
Right.
meet Christmas Day. So we recorded a specific message that was like, hey, watch this at some point during the last week of the year. And so that's like I'm sitting there talking to the camera. We're doing an increasing amount of outreach ministry digitally. And so we're recording videos on specific topics that we're then creating social media ads to try to get in front of people who don't go to church. And so that's where like it's not just clips of our sermons, but it's actually us talking to the camera about specific things. So in that kind of a situation, I mean, that's just a really different thing. In some way, it's much more intimate, right? Because in a big room, people may or may not really see your facial expressions, but on the camera, they're going to really see
Definite.
it. So it's close. It's a little more intimate. It's probably shorter. So if you think about some of the differences, I think one difference has to do with how quickly you have to grab people. If you are giving a 30-minute talk in a room, you've got a couple minutes to grab people. If you're creating digital content that's to be watched in that
Mhm.
moment, you've got 10 or 15 seconds to grab people. So I think that's a big difference. Anything you'd add to that on that one?
Absolutely. I would go back to what you were talking about in, I think it was your ABCs. In teaching, you're assuming that people already care about the content, whereas in preaching, you're assuming that people don't care and you have to compel them to care. I say that that absolutely applies here.
Yeah, in digital preaching, you're assuming they really don't
They
care.
really
I
don't
gotta get them
care.
fast.
And I think that there is a potential, man, I could go so many different directions, but there is a potential to feel like, well, I've got to be something different. I've got to, maybe I have to manipulate who I am to capture their attention. And that's really not true. Be more of who you are, lean into who you are, but just be intentional in those first couple seconds as to what you're saying, because they don't give a rip about anything you're doing
Yeah.
unless it pertains specifically to them, and even more so specifically to something that's on their mind in the moment. So,
Yeah, so I think that's a big difference. The other difference is when you're at least when you're on stage, typically your gestures are bigger, your voice is louder, you can really kind of hoot and holler, and your facial expressions don't necessarily matter quite as much. It's almost the opposite when
Mhm.
you're speaking to a camera. Your 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 expression matters a lot. Like Brady Shearer, who I know does a lot of church marketing
Mhm.
videos, and he basically says that at any point, if you're talking to a camera, they should be able to take a freeze frame and you should look ridiculous in your face. And of course, he's exaggerating to
Right.
make the point, but to say you got to be far more expressive with your face when you're preaching to a camera than you think. But you probably need to tone down your hand movements, your gestures. You're not, in many cases, walking around or moving as much. So that has to come down. And it's pretty weird if you're really like what I would call fourth gear, letting it rip big time with vocally as you're just talking to a camera. Because again, that's an intimate moment. And if I was just sitting here talking with you, Dave, even like I am right now, it would feel very weird for me to start semi yelling,
Right.
because that just isn't what this feels like. Whereas if I'm in a big room and there's, dozens or hundreds of people, like, well, now it's like I'm letting it rip.
Yeah.
So I think those are some of the differences.
You have a lot more room to work with spatially and environmentally in a large room, whereas on a camera, in a mode of speaking specifically straight to it, you have a a much smaller frame.
Yeah.
And you have to be more intentional with how you use that real estate because there's a lot less to work with. So,
It's also, I think another difference is how you can be tied to notes,
mhm,
right? It's really normal to see someone preaching in a room and they've got notes in front of them and they're looking down at them, maybe even frequently. That's weird if you're talking to a camera. It's not that you can't have notes and it's not that you can't glance down, right? Like I do teaching videos that are part of our preaching lab and our preaching course. And I have notes there in front of me on an iPad. I'm not looking at them much, but it does look strange if I'm talking to the camera and I have to keep looking
sure.
down, right? That would be like you and I in a conversation and I keep looking away. It's like, what's he looking at? What's going on? So I think that's another difference. And because of that, I think a lot of times preachers feel like, oh man, I got to get it right. And I misspoke on that a little bit or that, and I think if you're doing a 2-minute vision video, yeah, you probably want to nail every sentence. If you're doing a 20-minute teaching at the end of the year on how to prepare for a new year, like I've done, well, I can have some ums and uhs, and it doesn't have to be exactly right. I've got a little more give. Now, I don't want that to be the first 10 seconds, but along the way, it's okay. We've talked about some of the stuff that's different as it relates to speaking to a camera directly, more like a talking head video.
Mhm.
What are some of the things you think are similar?
Number one, the audio has to be good. No matter where you're talking, whether it's on a stage, whether it's through a camera, whether it's on a podcast, doesn't matter what the quality of the visuals are. No one cares about that if it's unintelligible, if it's hard to listen to,
Hmm.
if there's distortion.
So you're saying like the video could even be somewhat grainy
Oh, yeah,
and bouncy, but as long as the audio is good, it can be okay.
absolutely. Now, you're not aiming for grainy
Sure.
and poorly framed.
Yeah.
But if it winds up being, like, for instance, right here, we record the video and we share those clips on Facebook and Instagram. But this is primarily an audio production.
Yeah.
There's been instances where the camera stopped working, but the audio was functional and we were able to produce the episode. Now, flip that around. If something was off with the audio and I went back and listened to it and it's all just really distorted and this is the way it is the entire time. Like,
Yeah.
nobody's going to listen to
Yeah.
that.
It's like, oh man.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's
Okay.
like, I want to hear this content, but so your audio.
But you're saying that would be true not just on a podcast like this,
Correct.
but on a video as well.
It would be on a video as well, and from the stage.
Yeah.
It is vital that you have a quality microphone and you have given consideration to your environment. Whether you are recording with somebody producing with a camera or you're just holding your phone and you're doing a selfie video, be mindful, is the room really echoey?
Yeah.
Or is the room, nice and damp? Like I've had a few times where I've had to record advertisements or record little snippets. I just go into my closet because the audio matters
Yeah.
that much.
Yeah. And I can imagine people maybe going, what's the big deal? Well, it's a big deal. Like, I think the reason we don't notice it is because it's usually good.
Right.
But you would notice it if it was bad, right? At our old building that we had a campus that was near a airport,
Uh-huh.
and we'd have all sorts of interference, and the mic would click a lot and make different, feedback sounds, and it was really hard to EQ it and dial it in. And man, when it would start acting up, I'd lose the whole room, right? It was like, but I'm sharing good stuff. But yeah, if it starts clicking and sounding weird, people are tuning out. So that's something that's similar. Other similarities you think when it comes to speak? Because, and the reason, I mean, you just said a minute
Yeah.
ago, like you've done a lot of live streaming
Mhm.
all the way back on a lot of these old apps. So this is where you have more experience than I do when it comes to actually talking to the camera.
It really is vital that you know exactly what you want to say when you're talking in a more short format video teaching. And so in a sermon, there is this compelling feeling to like, well, I want to say everything. And what we've found in coaching pastors and coaching preachers is really that gives this feeling like every sermon has to be a home run. Every sermon, you can't miss anything.
Mm-hmm.
It's not really about saying everything. It's about saying one thing, but really effectively.
Yeah.
And when you're talking about going into preaching through a camera, it's vital that you know exactly what you want to say. However, as you mentioned, if you mess up, what would you do in a live environment? You would recover.
Yeah.
You would just keep moving forward. You may make a self-deprecating joke. You may kind of like, oh, I can't get my words straight. And then you'd keep moving forward. And yes, be mindful of what type of video that you're doing. But if it's a little bit longer format, it's fine. Like
Yeah.
it humanizes you. You talked about in a previous episode how, some pastors feel like, well, I've got to be wearing the suit and the tie when I go to the grocery store, when I go to the park, because
Right.
I got to project. It's like, no, like let them see you as a real person.
Yeah.
Let your true personality comes out. And I think that's another thing that is similar in that it may take time for you to find your voice, but you should be dedicated to finding your voice as it relates to preaching through a camera. It's going to take some adjustment to go from, it's like preaching in big church and then preaching to seventh graders. Like there is
Yeah.
a shift that has to happen. And it doesn't just happen naturally. Like you need some reps and you need to keep getting intentional with it. And you need to watch yourself. How are you appearing to other people? Not because you want to present a false sense of who you are and you want to make sure that it's polished and it's nothing but you at your best, but to make sure that it is a true sense of who you are. And it's really conveying what you are. And I do think that as much as I said, you want to go in with one thing to say, I think you need to have some purpose behind that one thing that you're going to say. You shouldn't just pick up a camera and start live streaming for the sake of live streaming. I think you really need to have here's why we're going to be doing short videos for YouTube, or here's why we're going to hop onto Reels. Here's what the purpose is. And a really great way to do that might be to pair it up. We did an episode earlier this season about preaching through a fall launch. I think it was our first episode.
Yeah.
Man, that's a great opportunity to say, okay, we've been live streaming our services for a while. It largely doesn't impact what we do, but we know there's an appetite. We know there's a viewership out there. What would it look like for us to take this one step forward? Now, we did that at our church through the whole COVID thing. You started this whole thing with something called the Daily Dose. Talk to me real quick about what that was.
Yeah. When COVID hit and it was like, okay, we're not meeting, and it was figuring out we've got to have some way to try to stay connected and encouraging people. And so, yeah, we stole a thing called the Daily Dose from, I knew another church that had a thing. They had it like that all the time, just as a normal daily devotional. And so we started recording these little 3 to 5 minute Bible teaching, encouragement, devotional things, pretty much for the most part at the beginning on our phones. And it got a little better over time. And then at some point we realized like this has reached a saturation point and people are not engaging with this as much. It met its need for its time, and now it's not meeting its need as much. But yeah, we did that, and a lot of folks did that. And I just do think increasingly in this season of ministry, you're going to have to speak to the camera at some point.
Yeah.
At some point, you're going to have to make an announcement that you're going to send out to the whole church about something important, or, you're going to, whatever it is, like at some point you're going to have to do it. And so it is really worth thinking through how to do it well and practicing on some stuff that doesn't matter as much, so that when you have something that does matter,
right,
you can get it nailed.
I think another thing that's really important if you're going to be preaching through a camera is to give yourself grace, right?
Yep.
Give yourself grace to get good at it. It's going to take some time. I think what you could wind up doing with live streaming or recording reels, and when I say live stream, I mean like doing a Facebook Live. There's a tendency to just, I'm going to show up and say whatever stream of consciousness comes across my mind.
Yeah.
Maybe that's okay. If you've really mastered your material, maybe that's okay. But largely, you don't want to just like whatever comes to mind. You really want to make sure I know who I'm talking to. I'm purposeful with this content, and I'm going to shut it down as soon as I've said what it is I need to say. We're not going to drag this out.
I have a preacher friend who teaches communication courses at the college level, and he has a really interesting thing that he says, where he says, if you want me to talk for an hour, give me 10 minutes to prepare. If you want me to talk for a half hour, give me a week. If you want me to talk for 10 minutes, give me a month. And of course, it's not like he means that exactly.
Right.
But his point is, if I can just ramble on for an hour, I don't need any time to prepare for that. But if you need me to really dial something in for a couple minutes, I might need to actually think through what I'm going to say and how I'm going to say it and how I'm going to arrange it. It starts to matter a lot more.
So if we're going to look at, okay, maybe we want to introduce this with a fall launch or leading up to Christmas, whatever the case might be, the way I would do it is I'd ultimately reverse engineer what is the end result that I want.
Yeah.
I want people to show up to Christmas. There is a marketer who has a really great formula that I think could be super helpful in inspiring you to create some content, some good framework. But his name's Jeff Walker, and the formula that he uses is when we're getting ready to ask someone to do something, what we are going to do is we're going to provide so much value and so much content, and we are going to answer every question that we can up to a point. The point being, well, if you want the answer for this last, struggle, it's our product. Well, in the same way, if you're going to be leading up to Christmas, you would just reverse engineer. And so, okay, so in the end, Christ came. God had to become child or God had to become a human, and he came in the form of a child because he had to go through all of the same experiences and because he had to die in our place as one of us. And that's the end result. Well, you kind of backtrack that and you say, okay, well, what like that satisfies that. Well, come on Christmas Eve to hear about it. Well, what's the objection or what's the thing before that? And it's like, well, why did he have to be born of a virgin? Or why did he come at Bethlehem? Or why were there angels? Or what significance was there with John the Baptist? And you can start to piece that together. And so you start it off. And the first couple videos is we want to talk about really what Advent is all about, or we want to talk about why Christmas is significant. But at the end, you say, but if that was the only reason, it really wouldn't matter. In our next video, what we're going to be talking about is the significance of the virgin birth. And so that gives you something that you can do to start leading up. And that's a great way to use this format.
So we've been talking about what it is to preach directly to a camera.
Yeah.
But we said, for a lot of folks, it's also thinking through how do you preach to the room when the camera's on?
Right.
And so I think we should spend some time there. So why don't we take a quick break and we'll come back and talk about that.
All right. Your first 200 sermons are going to be terrible. This is something the late Tim Keller once said, meaning that no matter how hard you study, how many hours you put in, or how much you work on your preaching, there's this glass ceiling that can only be broken with more reps. So, getting reps becomes your main way of growing as a preacher. But what happens when you surpass 200 sermons? What are you supposed to work on? Where should you try and grow, or what muscles are you going to need to build to have a faithful and fruitful preaching ministry over the long haul? Well, the Preaching Lab is a curriculum developed by our co-host, Luke Simmons, that fills this gap and takes preachers beyond what they've learned in seminary or Bible college. This live experience provides preachers with meaningful feedback, insight, and instruction so that they can improve their preaching for a faithful and fruitful preaching ministry. During this 12-week preaching cohort, preachers learn of minor adjustments to their sermon habits that have a major impact on the preaching moment. Tweaks that nobody in your congregation has the ability or the confidence to give you. It's a deep inspection of your routines, habits, study, and preaching, all so that you can become a better steward of the gift God has given you every single week, an audience. This is your opportunity to return the favor back to your congregation and preach a sermon that is faithful and fruitful. Visit faithfulandfruitful.com/lab to learn more about the Preaching Lab live cohort, as well as the Preaching Lab on-demand video curriculum. Now back to the podcast. I remember when the new facility was built. So our church, I was not a part of it when it was meeting in a school, but then it moved into a retail or kind of like a business commercial complex area with some retail. And then right next door, we built the facility, which we're in now and have been in for several years. I remember when that facility was built and one of the pastors on staff was moving us around. He took me up into the video booth and I said, "Oh, wow, this is great for streaming." And he kind of made the comment. He's like, "We've made a philosophical decision just not to live stream." And I was like, "Why wouldn't you? Like, this content is fantastic." And it was just we believe that being present in the building is really what the church is. And if you miss it, you miss it. And I might be mixing up his words a little bit, but I know you were involved in that discussion. Like, that's not being made in a vacuum, but everything changed with COVID. So maybe walk me through just philosophically where you were at and why now we continue to live stream.
Yeah, that's a good question. I felt like, we didn't want to make it easier for people to not come. The thing I had kicked around was, would there be a way for us to provide a live stream that's specifically for members, that's specifically for folks who their kids are sick or something like that? And we kicked that idea around and just logistically couldn't really figure out how to do that. And yeah, we just kind of had hey, you need to be here thing. And I mean, we would always then post the sermon video the next day,
Mhm.
so it's not like we were totally against that. Part of it too was really to be able to provide a good live stream experience of music takes a lot of work. That's not very good to make it,
It's the
it's not,
audio.
yeah, it's the audio. It's kind of what you were talking about earlier, right? It's not easy to do it well. So that was a piece of it as well, is we felt like if we can't really deliver an online live stream experience that's very good, then it actually is giving the wrong impression of our church, because our in the room experience is really good. And if you watch it and go, that just doesn't sound good. So it was a combination of those things. Then COVID hits and it's like, well, this is the only choice it feels like we have. It's either this or nothing. And I know some churches that decided nothing. I mean, not many, but a few
Some.
did. And, in that time, we also developed more of the skills, developed more of the ability to be able to do it well. And so we do it. We do it now.
We do it now and we broadcast. And there's been plenty of Sunday mornings where we've been unable to attend and we watch and we enjoy it. And in those moments, I've realized that we have shifted and we are doing it, but we're also being a little bit more intentional about how we're doing it. One of the things that you will notice if you watch a Redemption Gateway live stream is that at the very beginning, someone from the church, sometimes it's the preacher, sometimes it's one of the pastors, sometimes it's a combination of people, will just welcome everybody to the live stream. And I think that's great. I don't think it's rocket science. I think that makes sense.
Yeah, it's pre-recorded.
It's pre-recorded.
Yep.
And one of the things that is intentional to be mentioned, at least in the ones that I've seen, is, hey, we cannot wait for you to come back. We're excited to have you on live stream, but we really look forward to having you come back. And I think that's just a great way of underscoring the value of being present whenever relevant. We wind up mentioning that in the service as well, not as it pertains to live streaming, but the value of meeting and being present in person and not relegating it to an online experience.
We've tried to be intentional about that. And really, I mean, it's just wild because almost everybody who ends up coming to a newcomer class or something like that will say, I've watched a few times online before they
Mhm.
came, right? Just like if I'm thinking about trying out a new restaurant, I look it up on Yelp and I look at pictures of the food, and I can't quite sample it, but I would if I could. And that's really the same thing that's going on. And so it's interesting, even in our stats over the last year, just YouTube knows you better than you know yourself. I mean, they know all kinds of stuff about people. And what YouTube tells us is that 75% of our live stream audience is 65 years old or over. And interestingly, this is actually, in a way, one of the reasons also why we weren't live streaming before is I had a mentor pastor who was in his 60s, and he said every church that he knows of that started live streaming, not all, but a bunch of the older folks would quit coming because they'd go, I don't really want to deal with the parking,
Mhm.
and I don't really want to I don't like the music anyway, and I'm just kind of there for the sermon. So I'm going to just watch Charles Stanley in the morning on TV and then tune into the live stream. And that's going to be my experience of church. And I don't know that that's happening in our case necessarily. I think we have an interesting dynamic in Arizona because we have so many snowbirds,
Right.
folks who are here for the winter and then go back to Minnesota or go back to Colorado or go back to wherever for the summer. My parents are an interesting case study where they do that, where they're down here in Phoenix for most of the school year and then go back to Colorado. They used to have a home church in Colorado and a home church down here. Now they just have a home church down here and they live stream when they're in Colorado. Now that kind of bums me out
Hmm.
because I think like I liked their church in Colorado and I think them having an in-person experience there would be great. But they feel like, no, we love our church down in Phoenix. We want to watch that. So I think that's some of what's going on. And
I know Aunt Betty said, tell me after you've preached 200 sermons. Is Aunt Betty streaming live?
I
now
don't
that
think
you've-
I don't think she's paying attention. So yeah. So I mean, I think what you have for the most part is people who are out of town are watching it. And if you're talking Stephen Furtick and Elevation, and I'm sure they're doing something totally different, and their quality of production is totally different,
Mhm.
right? But for us, a good large church, higher production quality than a lot of smaller churches can do, but not ooh la la.
Mhm.
My sense of it is the people who are watching they're away for whatever reason, or they're homesick, or with a sick kid, or they're kicking the tires and they might want to come check it out and they're sampling it. I do think there's a little bit of like people who go, "Ah, you know what? We don't feel like going today. I'm a little tired. We'll watch it online." And watching it online means it's on while they do laundry
Right.
or have breakfast or something. Like I don't think most of those folks are like especially dialed in. But I also think part of what COVID taught us is that at best a live stream experience is like, meh,
Right.
okay, it's fine. So I think that was some of it. I thought beforehand, man, if people can watch it online, they will. COVID taught us if people watch it online, they would still rather be in the room.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll offer it there. It'll be a nice supplement for folks who really can't make it or for folks who are kicking the tires. It has changed our like get involved in the church process. We used to say, hey, at the very first newcomer thing, hey, come here and then try to just attend the church for 2 or 3 months before you really sink down roots. Now people come and in some cases they've been watching for multiple
Right.
months, right? Or people move from another state and it's like they've already done their church hopping and their church shopping and figuring it out. Like they come and it's weird because it's like I'm meeting them for the first time. They feel like they know me because
Yeah.
they've been watching my sermons for
Yeah.
a month or two while they've decided this is where we're going to go to church when we move to Phoenix. So that's weird. You know,
So
that's a new dynamic.
That's an interesting dynamic. I experienced some level of success with Periscope. And so I would launch a live stream and I'd talk and I'd have, 100, 200 people watching, which is really bizarre, like just conceptually. But when I would meet those people live, I didn't know who they were,
Sure.
but they're very much as you could imagine, just like they're excited to meet you because you've had influence in their life
Uh-huh.
over X number of weeks, months, years, whatever the case might be. And so this is a really big moment for them. And so I had to learn how to be gracious in that moment and how to really be humble and be like, oh, thank you so much for sharing that with me. I'm so glad that it's been helpful. What's been most helpful for you? And really turn it around and make it back on them because it does feel kind of cool to be known.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you really want to be a good reflection of who you are normally. And I think that's actually something that I was thinking about as you were talking. You mentioned some of these larger churches that have these huge productions. Wherever you're trying to live stream, whatever you're trying to record videos that you're going to put out, there is just a really good practice of choose how you want the production to be and then commit to that. If you're trying to do something that is real high production, that could be confused with a Hollywood production, you need to commit all the way to that. Because if you're trying to do it and you do it halfway, it's going to come off as cheesy. It's going to come off as corny. If you're saying, no, we just want to do a good representation of what it is to attend Sunday morning, well, that's not a security camera feed, right? That's not a good representation of what it's like to be in the room.
Yeah.
And
it's
so,
not my daughter's phone.
Right.
You
may want to have a couple cameras that capture different angles of the room so that when somebody shows up on Sunday, it feels familiar, it feels consistent, and it feels like, this is what I thought it would be like.
Yeah.
So,
I think that's right. It's also, you just got to figure out your philosophy. So even though like now, okay, we do live stream it, but we haven't tried to cultivate it as an online campus. We haven't tried to cultivate it as an online community. I think it's cool if someone finds it, if a friend from somewhere else recommends it, but I don't feel called to shepherd people from other states who stumble on our live stream. Philosophically, I'm just not interested in that. I love digital ministry as it relates to evangelism. I'm not a fan of it as it relates to being a member of a church online from another state. That just doesn't, we could have a whole conversation about why that is.
Yeah.
So like we make a pretty intentional choice where we don't even really acknowledge the live stream in our service. And some people might go, well, that's a mistake. Maybe. But, a lot of churches, they'll go, hey, we want to welcome those of you joining us online. We did that for a while. And I just was like, I don't actually want to welcome those of you joining us online. Like, yeah, you're there, but I'm not trying to talk to you. I'm trying to talk to the people in the room.
Yeah.
So I'm cool with you listening in. I hope it's a good taste of what you wish you had if you were here or what you're going to get when you come. But I'm not trying to make this a substitute for our in-person experience.
Before we hit the big giant record button, you said really, when we decided to live stream, we were already doing that amount of work. It was just broadcast locally on the campus. Now we're just
Yeah, we
broadcasting
had
it
a nursing
elsewhere.
mother's room that,
Yeah.
that was not physically connected to our space, and we were broadcasting into that. We were broadcasting it into the lobby. So we were kicking, but and through that, we were kicking the tires. Hey, we're doing all this work to stream this into these other rooms. Should we just go ahead and stream it online? I guess what I would say is if I was trying to really create a digital ministry that was going to really try to reach people through online, I wouldn't do it as a live stream. I would do it as what we were talking about in the first half of this
Uh-huh.
conversation, as intentional videos. And so I know some churches that are doing that, where what they'll do is they'll actually have more of a studio recording of the same sermon,
Mhm.
and then they'll just have whatever they do in person. And to me, just strategically in terms of digital ministry, that seems like a better idea because the quality is going to be better. It's designed for that. Live stream's fine as a supplement, but I don't even think live stream's typically the best way to reach people evangelistically.
Whatever you wind up doing, if you are broadcasting it on social media platforms, what have you, it's probably also a good idea just to have somebody monitoring comments, monitoring what's being said. One of our clients has had recently, when I say our clients, I run a marketing business. And
Yeah.
so one of our clients recently has had a string of videos that they've not gone viral, but 13,000, 12,000, 8,000 views. And man, people are quick to criticize. I've realized that just being at the ready to be able to answer comments, that's been something that you don't let it spiral out of control. You kind of box it in a little bit. And in a lot of these shorter takes, folks will find something to crit. Well, you didn't say this. Well, it's a 60-second video.
Yeah.
And so just being at the ready to say, hey, thanks so much for watching. We're really glad that you like this. This is actually part of a larger 5-part series, and we talk about exactly what you mentioned. There was
Yeah.
just no way for us to capture it in 60 seconds.
Sure.
So just being ready for whatever follow-up comes, should you choose to start broadcasting elsewhere. I think the last thing that I would want to say, and this is really not a good ribbon, but I think lighting is a huge thing as well. I know
Mhm.
that I said the audio is what matters the most, and it really, really does. Because if it's unintelligible or if it's rough to listen to, people are just going to scroll on. They're not even going to stick around to see, well, is it worth it? They won't. But just be intentional with the lighting as well. Do what you can to present yourself as a true form of what it would be like to meet you. Don't be broadcasting with like laundry in the background or recording, with like garbage.
Yeah.
Just think through, how do I want to present our church? How do I want to present my teaching?
Mhm.
How do I want to present the experience to a group of people? And then be consistent with that. And lighting has a huge part to do with
Well, and we've all experienced that even just through all the Zoom calls we've all been on the last number of years.
Yeah.
I mean, there is a big difference between, someone who the they're in front of right, the window's behind them and
Yeah.
they're like a silhouette versus they're looking at the window and it's behind the camera, right?
Yeah.
That's a different kind of experience. It's different if the camera is more at eye level or a little bit above than if the camera's way down low and it's looking up at them. Yeah, so it is little things like that. You learn that along the way. But yeah, this is a new dynamic. It's a new thing, and I mean, at some point we'll all laugh that this was a new thing.
it. It's not going away.
It's not going away, and I'm grateful for the people who are being innovative and trying to do stuff with it. And we're trying to do our part through some of the digital outreach and things like that to play around with it. But yeah, it's a new world.
So thank you so much for listening through this episode. I hope that you enjoyed maybe some perspectives on what you could be doing, maybe some insight on how you could take what you're already doing, just make some simple shifts and get a major impact out of those simple shifts. There's really no right way to do it, but there are some basic principles. And I think just approaching preaching through a camera with a level of humility and teachability and being willing to kind of absorb, I think that's just a good practice for anything and everything as it relates to honing your craft and really trying to just elevate what it is you do. If you enjoyed this, we'd love to hear from you. You can always reach out to us, even if you didn't enjoy it. I mean, you could tell us, hey, I would enjoy a conversation about this. info@faithfulandfruitful.com. It would be fun to hear from you. We've had a few folks message us, just sharing some encouragements, sharing some ideas. And if you'd like to do that, it would be it would be great to hear from you. You can always leave a review at Apple Podcast and Spotify. That's how other preachers are going to be able to find the podcast. So if you do think it's helpful and the church would be good to have more pastors having a voice of encouragement, please share that. But next episode, I don't even know what our next episode is. I know we're going to be talking about preaching through notes. So yeah, stick around and we'll hear that. You excited for it?
Yeah, I think all these conversations are interesting and fun to me. They're interesting. I like having them, and hopefully everyone likes listening.
All right, we'll talk to you next time. Bye.